I think probably the tariffs are bigger than GM thought, much more aggressive than GM thought. So they've withdrawn the guidance, and they had a $6 billion share buyback.
So today we heard from GM. They announced their earnings, and it wasn't worse than expected. Remember, they've been pretty vocal about how these auto sector tariffs, it's a 25% tariff on all imported foreign cars and parts, would impact their bottom line. They had initially said likely a $4 to $5 billion hit throughout the year.
At the overall $4 to $5 billion impact from tariffs that we shared. That is what we know now based on the clarity that we're given, and we are very appreciative that the president provided that clarity.
Factories falling silent, workers walking out with toolboxes in hand, and an entire industry, once the pride of American strength, now staring at the possibility of collapse. Late May 2025 delivered a shockwave that no one saw coming. A single shareholder letter from General Motors sent Wall Street into panic mode. It revealed something brutal. Trump's aggressive new tariffs weren't protecting American jobs. They were bleeding the company dry. Billions of dollars gone in a matter of months. The fallout was immediate. Production lines slowed to a crawl. Suppliers shuttered their doors, and thousands of workers across the U.S. and Canada suddenly found themselves in limbo. For towns built around auto plants, this wasn't just bad news. It was an earthquake that shook every diner, gas station, and grocery store connected to the heartbeat of the industry. Trump had promised that tariffs would put America first, shielding workers and giving Detroit a fighting chance. But behind the speeches and the headlines, the reality looked very different. Instead of revival, America's largest automaker found itself on the edge of disaster. And the questions people are now asking are darker than ever. Is this the beginning of a full-scale economic unraveling? Could 50,000 jobs really vanish almost overnight? And what happens to America's future if the very companies meant to lead the electric revolution are now struggling just to survive? This is the story of how a political gamble turned into a crisis for General Motors, the workers who depend on it, and perhaps the entire American economy. When President Trump announced sweeping 25% tariffs on imported vehicles and auto parts in April 2025, it was framed as nothing short of a revolution. His message was bold and simple. America had been cheated for decades, and it was time to fight back. The White House promised that these tariffs would rebuild Detroit, protect workers from foreign competition, and finally force companies like General Motors to bring jobs home. On paper, the pitch sounded patriotic, a new golden era for U.S. manufacturing, the kind of move that would supposedly breathe life back into Rust Belt towns long left behind. Supporters hailed it as the ultimate America First policy, a hammer blow to overseas competition. Trump himself called it a historic correction, insisting that this was the reset button the industry desperately needed. But inside the walls of General Motors, the mood was very different. Numbers don't lie, and the numbers painted a grim picture. Finance teams quickly realized that the tariffs weren't a boost, they were a direct hit. Nearly 40% of GM's vehicle components come from abroad, meaning almost every Silverado pickup, every Equinox SUV, and every Escalade rolling off the line was now more expensive to build. CEO Mary Barra made the rare move of sounding the alarm in a blunt letter to shareholders. She warned that the tariffs would carve up to $5 billion out of GM's earnings for the year. That wasn't just pocket change, it was money earmarked for the Ultium battery program, the company's future in electric vehicles. Suddenly, the dream of leading the EV race was being sacrificed to cover costs that hadn't existed before. And the pain didn't stop at the boardroom. Every imported steering knuckle, every electronic sensor, every piece of aluminum or steel now carried a tariff-shaped price tag. One simple part that used to cost $28 suddenly jumped to $36. That may not sound like much until you multiply it across the 30,000 plus parts that make up a single modern vehicle. Add in existing tariffs on steel and aluminum, and each truck carried an extra $3,000 in costs before it even reached the showroom. For a company already operating on razor-thin margins, this was devastating. Investors knew it. Wall Street analysts immediately downgraded GM's outlook. Suddenly, what was sold as a bold protectionist gamble was starting to look more like a financial time bomb. But the real shock wasn't about balance sheets, it was about the people. And the first to feel the blow weren't the executives in Detroit, but the workers on the factory floor. And that's where the story takes a darker turn. The numbers may have terrified investors, but for workers, the crisis hit with brutal speed. It started quietly, just a single announcement in Detroit. On April 11th, GM's flagship Factory Zero halted production, sending 200 workers home without warning. The official explanation? Slowing demand. But on the shop floor, nobody believed it. Whispers spread quickly. The real culprit was tariff-driven costs that made every truck rolling off the line more expensive than the market could handle. That shutdown was just the beginning. Within weeks, the pain crossed the border into Canada. GM's Cami plant in Ingersoll, Ontario, once hailed as the future of electric vans, suddenly suspended production until October. That meant 1,200 layoffs in a single stroke. Days later, the Oshawa truck plant cut its overnight shift, eliminating another 700 jobs. In just 2 weeks, nearly 2,000 families lost their paychecks. And the devastation didn't stop with GM. Suppliers, the lifeblood of the auto ecosystem, began collapsing like dominoes. Adient, one of the largest seat manufacturers in North America, shut down 2 Tennessee plants, slashing 400 union jobs. Small machine shops in Indiana and Ohio reported orders drying up overnight. Even the trucking firms hauling parts between factories saw trailers sitting idle. Economists call this a ripple effect. Workers have another name for it: survival. A machine shop in Indiana warned it could lose half its staff if demand didn't recover soon. Restaurants near Detroit's auto plants reported a 40% drop in customers. Families who'd once counted on overtime shifts to pay their mortgages were suddenly skipping meals out, cutting back on groceries, and wondering how long their savings would last. Executives in Detroit gave the crisis a sanitized label: elastic idling. They framed these shutdowns as temporary pauses until costs stabilized. But for the people walking out of the factory gates, temporary was little comfort. Every week of idling meant lost paychecks, unpaid bills, and mounting fear. That this wasn't a pause, it was the beginning of something permanent. And the timing made it worse. Workers remembered Lordstown in 2019, when GM shut down the plant with little warning and thousands of jobs vanished overnight. Many still kept their toolboxes packed at home, just in case history repeated itself. For them, this wasn't just about cars. It was about dignity, survival, and a future that seemed to be slipping away. By the end of April, the headlines were everywhere. Auto jobs vanish across Midwest, Canadian factories go dark, suppliers on the brink. But behind the headlines were families watching their livelihoods evaporate in real time. And while factories stood silent, a bigger crisis was brewing: the collapse of GM's most ambitious gamble, electric vehicles. For years, General Motors had sold a vision of the future, one where gleaming electric trucks rolled off Detroit assembly lines, powered by cutting-edge Ultium batteries. Billions had been poured into this dream. Executives promised shareholders, workers, and even the government that GM would lead America into the electric era. But by mid-2025, that dream was unraveling before everyone's eyes. First came the blow no one expected: the repeal of the $7,500 federal EV tax credit. For years, that incentive had been the difference between a family saying yes to an electric car or walking away from the dealership. Overnight, the sticker price for EVs felt out of reach for middle-class buyers. Then came the second hit. Congress froze funding for a nationwide charging network, the very backbone that EV adoption depended on. Without enough charging stations, electric trucks weren't just expensive, they were inconvenient. A Silverado EV might promise 300 miles of range, but what good was that if drivers couldn't find a charger on the road? And just as GM scrambled to adapt, the third and most brutal punch landed: tariffs on imported minerals. Nickel, cobalt, lithium, all essential for batteries, skyrocketed in price. The very core of EV production became more expensive, squeezing margins that were already razor thin. The result was devastating. At Detroit's Factory Zero, instead of humming assembly lines, workers stared at a warehouse filled with unsold Silverado EVs, wrapped in plastic, baking under the summer heat. Each truck represented $45,000 in capital sitting idle, batteries degrading with every passing week. GM's own data told a chilling story. Consumer interest in EVs had been cut in half since incentives vanished. Even desperate offers like 0% financing couldn't overcome the double punch of soaring insurance premiums and rising electricity rates. Families who once dreamed of driving electric began returning to gasoline SUVs, or worse, putting off purchases altogether. Chief Financial Officer Paul Jacobson admitted what many feared: for GM's Ultium program to reach profitability, the company needed to sell at least 100,000 trucks annually. Projections for 2025 pointed to just 65,000, nowhere near enough. Instead of being the company's crown jewel, EVs were becoming its greatest liability. The shift in consumer mood was palpable. Some early adopters who once championed EVs began voicing frustrations about reliability, charging delays, and sticker shock. Online forums filled with buyers regretting their purchase, complaining that the future felt like an overpriced gamble. Inside GM, the mood was grim. Billions tied up in unsold vehicles, storage lots filling up like graveyards of a failed promise, and an executive team forced to dial back production while praying for cheaper battery breakthroughs in the future. And this raised the question no one wanted to ask out loud: was America's electric revolution doomed from the start? Or was it being strangled to death by tariffs and short-sighted politics before it ever had the chance to succeed? But while executives struggled with technology and numbers, a different kind of crisis was erupting on the ground, inside the unions, and among the very workers who were supposed to benefit from these tariffs. And the divisions that followed were years General Motors had sold a vision of the future, one where gleaming electric trucks rolled off Detroit assembly lines powered by cutting-edge Ultium batteries. Billions had been poured into this dream. Executives promised shareholders, workers, and even the government that GM would lead America into the electric era. But by mid-2025, that dream was unraveling before everyone's eyes. First came the blow no one expected: the repeal of the $7,500 federal EV tax credit. For years, that incentive had been the difference between a family saying yes to an electric car or walking away from the dealership. Overnight, the sticker price for EVs felt out of reach for middle-class buyers. Then came the second hit. Congress froze funding for a nationwide charging network, the very backbone that EV adoption depended on. Without enough charging stations, electric trucks weren't just expensive, they were inconvenient. A Silverado EV might promise 300 miles of range, but what good was that if drivers couldn't find a charger on the road? And just as GM scrambled to adapt, the third and most brutal punch landed: tariffs on imported minerals. Nickel, cobalt, lithium, all essential for batteries, skyrocketed in price. The very core of EV production became more expensive, squeezing margins that were already razor thin. The result was devastating. At Detroit's Factory Zero, instead of humming assembly lines, workers stared at a warehouse filled with unsold Silverado EVs, wrapped in plastic, baking under the summer heat. Each truck represented $45,000 in capital sitting idle, batteries degrading with every passing week. GM's own data told a chilling story. Consumer interest in EVs had been cut in half since incentives vanished. Even desperate offers like 0% financing couldn't overcome the double punch of soaring insurance premiums and rising electricity rates. Families who once dreamed of driving electric began returning to gasoline SUVs, or worse, putting off purchases altogether. Chief Financial Officer Paul Jacobson admitted what many feared: for GM's Ultium program to reach profitability, the company needed to sell at least 100,000 trucks annually. Projections for 2025 pointed to just 65,000. Nowhere near enough. Instead of being the company's crown jewel, EVs were becoming its greatest liability. The shift in consumer mood was palpable. Some early adopters who once championed EVs began voicing frustrations about reliability, charging delays, and sticker shock. Online forums filled with buyers regretting their purchase, complaining that the future felt like an overpriced gamble. Inside GM, the mood was grim. Billions tied up in unsold vehicles, storage lots filling up like graveyards of a failed promise, and an executive team forced to dial back production while praying for cheaper battery breakthroughs in the future. And this raised the question no one wanted to ask out loud: was America's electric revolution doomed from the start? Or was it being strangled to death by tariffs and short-sighted politics before it ever had the chance to succeed? But while executives struggled with technology and numbers, a different kind of crisis was erupting on the ground, inside the unions, and among the very workers who were supposed to benefit from these tariffs. And the divisions that followed would tear the labor movement apart. As layoffs mounted and factories idled, General Motors leadership hoped Washington might step in with relief. Behind closed doors, executives pressed for flexibility, arguing that without changes, entire plants could go dark. Workers, too, waited anxiously, hoping the same president who promised to protect American jobs would at least acknowledge their growing pain. But when Trump finally addressed GM's warnings, his response was as blunt as it was shocking. He didn't soften his tone, didn't offer compromise, and didn't reassure workers fearing for their paychecks. Instead, he fired back with a simple message: GM made its choices. Now it has to adapt. To many workers, it felt like a slap in the face. These weren't just corporate choices. They were mortgages, medical bills, and families left without income. The man who had sold tariffs as a lifeline was now dismissing their consequences as GM's problem to solve. And while factories sat silent, Trump turned to political theater. At rallies, he bragged about standing up to foreign cheaters and protecting America's auto industry. Supporters cheered. But for the thousands of workers who had just lost shifts, the words rang hollow. A Detroit worker put it bluntly. "We're the ones paying the price for his speeches." Wall Street wasn't convinced either. Within days of Trump's comments, analysts downgraded GM's outlook yet again, slashing investor confidence. Headlines declared that the auto giant was on shaky ground, and whispers about deeper cuts began spreading. The message was clear: Washington wasn't going to blink. GM was on its own. And for workers already torn between loyalty and survival, Trump's dismissal only deepened the divisions. Some still clung to the idea that tariffs would bring factories roaring back. Others saw only layoffs, unpaid bills, and empty promises. And it wasn't just GM anymore. The ripple effects were spreading fast, across the auto industry, across supply chains, and into companies that had nothing to do with Detroit. Because what started as a GM problem was quickly snowballing into an industry-wide crisis. By the time summer of 2025 rolled around, it was no longer just a GM story. The tariffs had lit a fuse under the entire auto industry, and the explosions were spreading in every direction. Take Stellantis, the multinational automaker that owns Chrysler. Its Windsor plant in Canada, the last minivan facility left on the continent, was once a steady source of jobs for thousands of families. Suddenly, production schedules swung wildly from week to week. Workers couldn't plan their lives because nobody knew if the plant would be running full shifts, half shifts, or none at all. That uncertainty rippled south, triggering hundreds of layoffs in Indiana and Michigan, where suppliers depended on steady Windsor orders. Then came Volvo. Once considered insulated from American political storms, even they weren't spared. Fleet buyers balked at paying $180,000 for trucks that, just months earlier, had cost $165,000 overseas. The math didn't work, and layoffs loomed across Pennsylvania and Virginia. Suddenly, thousands of American jobs tied to a Swedish brand were caught in the crossfire of Washington's tariffs. And across the Pacific, the picture looked even worse. GM Korea, which exports nearly 90% of its vehicles straight into the U.S., teetered on the brink of collapse. The comparison to GM's withdrawal from Australia in 2017, when an entire national auto industry disappeared, wasn't just academic. Analysts openly warned, if tariffs didn't change, GM Korea could be next. Other foreign brands scrambled to adapt. Hyundai and Kia rushed to expand plants in Alabama and Georgia to escape tariff costs. But their new facilities wouldn't be ready until 2027. That left a dangerous 2-year gap, one filled with uncertainty, shrinking margins, and volatile pricing. Even the supply chain itself began to fray in ways few had imagined. Consider a single Mexican piston. Under the old system, it might cross the U.S. border 3 times during production before ending up in a finished vehicle. Now, every crossing meant another round of paperwork, another chance for a tariff to be applied, another risk of costly delays. One Ontario supplier lost more than $1 million in a single week because of a simple customs error. Step by step, global integration, the very system that had made North American auto manufacturing efficient, was starting to collapse. Industry experts warned of a new age of regional silos, where countries no longer trusted cross-border supply chains. Inside GM headquarters, planners sketched out 3 possible futures. Best case scenario, parts from Brazil and Mexico start flowing again, restoring Silverado production by late June. Margins remain thin but positive. Middle path, more tariffs on Japanese and Korean electronics push infotainment. Costs sky high, forcing more plant slowdowns and credit downgrades. Worst case scenario, China retaliates by cutting off rare earth exports. Battery production halts, unfinished trucks pile up, and plants across the US and Canada fall silent indefinitely. The truth was simple. GM was no longer fighting just for its profits. It was fighting for survival. And with it, the survival of America's place in the global auto industry hung in the balance. But even as cars and trucks disappeared from assembly lines, a much bigger story was unfolding quietly. One that reached beyond the auto sector, beyond Detroit, and deep into the very foundations of North America's economy. Because what came next wasn't just about cars, it was about the unraveling of America's partnership with Canada itself. For more than half a century, the United States and Canada built their prosperity on one simple truth: their economies were deeply, almost inseparably, intertwined. Canadian oil fueled U.S. refineries. American factories depended on Canadian parts, and Canadian data flowed through U.S. servers as if the border barely existed. But in 2025, that partnership began to crack. Slowly at first, then all at once. The first break came in energy. For decades, pipelines from Alberta had pumped a steady stream of oil and natural gas into U.S. refineries. It was a bond so deep that few ever questioned its permanence. But suddenly, Canada was turning elsewhere. Deals with Norway, the UK, and Australia allowed Canadian firms to refine more resources domestically and bypass U.S. infrastructure altogether. Asian buyers snapped up shipments that once automatically flowed south. American pipelines that had always run at full capacity were now operating at just two-thirds efficiency. Refineries in the Midwest faced underutilization, debts piled up, and stock values slid into double-digit losses. Next came technology. For years, a powerful Silicon Valley giant dominated Canadian data flows, pulling in nearly $2 billion annually by managing banking records, hospital data, and government networks. The assumption was simple: Canada had no other options, but that assumption shattered. Singapore and South Korea offered faster processing speeds. Switzerland drew in Canadian banks with its reputation for secrecy. Britain's growing artificial intelligence sector tempted Canadian institutions away from U.S. dominance. And then came the final blow: Canada's own trans-Pacific data cables connecting directly to Asia and Europe. Suddenly, U.S. systems weren't just unnecessary. They were being bypassed completely. Even manufacturing, the pride of North American integration, began to unravel. An American industrial conglomerate that once thrived on cross-border production found itself being pushed aside. Canadian plants welcomed partnerships with Japanese precision engineering and South Korean shipbuilders, cutting American suppliers out of the loop. Leaked documents revealed desperate internal memos: restructure supply chains immediately or lose relevance. And the fallout wasn't just corporate, it was human. In Buffalo, restaurants that once served Canadian truckers watched their customers vanish. In Grand Forks, logistics firms laid off staff after losing cross-border contracts. In Michigan, local banks warned of collapsing loan repayments as auto workers missed paychecks. Entire towns built on the assumption of cross-border trade were now struggling to survive. Economists gave it a name: the Great Displacement of North American Integration. For decades, geography guaranteed partnership. Canada and the U.S. were bound together. But now, every deal Canada signed with Europe or Asia was proof that the old order was crumbling. The numbers painted a brutal picture: more than $11 billion in direct U.S. losses, with ripple effects swelling that figure to nearly $27 billion. Behind those statistics were families forced to reinvent themselves or risk extinction. Step by step, Canada was proving it could thrive without American dependence. And each time a new deal was signed, each time a U.S. supplier was cut out, America's grip on its closest ally weakened further. And that left one chilling question: if even Canada, America's most reliable partner, was walking away, who would be next? Because this wasn't just about jobs anymore. It was about the unraveling of America's entire economic dominance. Tariffs were supposed to be a weapon of revival. They were sold as the cure to decades of industrial decline. A bold promise that America could claw back its factories, protect its workers, and force the world to play by its rules. But by mid-2025, the reality looked nothing like the promise. Instead of roaring assembly lines, America was left with shuttered factories, idled workers, and billions of dollars in evaporating profits. Instead of protecting jobs, tariffs had pushed General Motors to the brink, choking its electric ambitions and forcing tens of thousands of families into uncertainty. The fallout spread far beyond Detroit. Stellantis, Volvo, Hyundai, and Kia all felt the squeeze. Supply chains that once connected three countries now frayed at every crossing. And Canada, America's most reliable partner for generations, was charting a new path, forging alliances that deliberately bypassed the U.S. The cost wasn't just financial, it was deeply human. Restaurants in Michigan closing their doors, machine shops in Indiana preparing mass layoffs, border towns like Buffalo and Grand Forks losing the very lifeblood that had sustained them for decades. Workers packing up their toolboxes with the same dread that haunted Lordstown in 2019. Families wondering if tomorrow's paycheck would even come. And while workers bore the brunt, Washington offered little more than political theater. President Trump dismissed GM's warnings, telling the company to adapt. His rallies celebrated the tariffs as victories, even as unemployment lines grew longer. Investors fled, analysts downgraded, and America's auto industry, once the pride of the world, teetered on the edge of collapse. So where does this leave the country? Some hold out hope that demand could rebound, that cheaper batteries could rescue EVs, or that policy shifts might reopen assembly lines. Others fear the silence spreading across factories is not temporary, but the beginning of a long, painful decline. The truth is that America stands at a crossroads. One path offers adaptation, reinvention, and a painful but possible recovery. The other leads to more shuttered plants, more lost communities, and a slow erosion of U.S. influence in both industry and global trade. And the stakes couldn't be higher, because this isn't just about GM or even about cars. It's about whether America can still control its economic destiny, or whether the world has already begun moving on without it. The question now is haunting in its simplicity. Is this the wake-up call America needs, or the final chapter of its manufacturing dominance? This conclusion pulls all threads together: GM, workers, Canada politics, global impact, balances reflection with a dramatic open-ended question, leaves viewers with something to think about long after the video ends. Tariffs were meant to be the spark of a new American revival. A policy bold enough to reverse decades of decline, to pull factories out of silence, and to put power back into the hands of American workers. For a moment, it even sounded believable, an industrial rebirth wrapped in patriotic slogans. But as the dust settled, the picture looked very different. Instead of humming assembly lines, the nation saw silence. Instead of job growth, thousands of pink slips. And instead of a confident leap into the electric future, General Motors, the company meant to lead the charge, was drowning in billions of dollars in losses, surrounded by unsold electric trucks gathering dust in the sun. The ripple effects touched everything: workers in Detroit, families in Ontario, suppliers in Indiana, restaurants in Michigan, refineries in Texas. Entire communities that had once trusted the promise of integration with Canada now faced the harsh reality of collapse. And through it all, Washington's answer was simple: adapt or be left behind. Meanwhile, Canada was moving forward, securing energy deals with Norway, building data pipelines to Asia, and forging partnerships with Europe. For decades, the U.S. had assumed Canada would always depend on its markets. But now the tables were turning. America's closest ally was proving it could thrive without Washington's approval. And that shift shook the very foundations of North America's economy. What does this all mean? On one hand, the U.S. could tighten its belt, invest in new technology, and claw its way back into global competitiveness. On the other, it could sink deeper into silence, watching as factories close, towns empty, and old alliances fade into history. And so America stands at a crossroads, caught between the story it wants to tell and the reality staring it in the face. The question is no longer just about General Motors. It's no longer just about tariffs or even jobs. It's about something far bigger: whether the United States can still control its destiny, or whether the world has already decided to move on. And that leaves us with one haunting thought: was this the first chapter of America's rebirth, or the opening lines of its industrial obituary?